In this episode, we're going to focus on the moment where risk management becomes a real decision instead of an analysis exercise, choosing how to treat an AI risk. Beginners often assume the goal of risk work is to eliminate risk, but in any real organization, risk cannot be eliminated, and trying to do so would stop progress entirely. The goal is to make deliberate choices about what risks to take, what risks to reduce, what risks to shift, and what risks to refuse. AI makes this especially important because AI can scale decisions quickly, can fail in subtle ways, and can create harms that feel unfair or opaque to the people affected. If you choose treatments poorly, you might either lock down useful innovation or, more dangerously, approve high-impact use cases with weak controls because the benefits sound exciting. Today we'll focus on 5 treatment choices you will see repeatedly: avoid, reduce, transfer, accept, and retire. By the end, you should be able to explain what each treatment means in the AI context, why it might be chosen, what evidence supports the choice, and how treatment decisions connect to governance, documentation, and monitoring over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to recognize that treatment decisions are not made in a vacuum because they must align with the organization's risk appetite, tolerance, and obligations. If leadership has low tolerance for safety harm, then safety-influencing AI risks will usually be treated aggressively, often through avoidance of certain automation or through strict reduction controls. If leadership has low tolerance for legal exposure, then risks tied to unexplainable decisions or weak documentation will often require reduction before deployment can proceed. If the organization's strategy depends on trust, then risks that could create unfair treatment or reputation damage will be treated cautiously, even if the financial benefit seems attractive. Treatment choices are also influenced by feasibility, meaning what controls the organization is capable of implementing and sustaining. A risk treatment plan that requires monitoring and documentation that nobody can maintain is not a plan. It is an assumption. In AI risk programs, the most defensible treatment decisions are those that are justified with evidence and that fit the organization's operating model. Beginners should learn to see treatment as a practical bargain between value and harm potential, backed by controls and accountability. Once you adopt that mindset, the 5 treatment options become clearer and less abstract. Avoid is the first treatment, and in plain language it means the organization chooses not to pursue a use case or not to allow a particular use pattern because the risk is too high or the harm is unacceptable. Avoidance does not mean the organization rejects all AI. It means it draws a boundary around specific high-risk applications. In AI, avoidance is often chosen when the decision context is high impact and the organization cannot provide adequate transparency, oversight, or fairness controls. It can also be chosen when the use requires data that cannot be used lawfully or ethically, or when vendor limitations prevent the organization from meeting obligations. Avoidance is a strong option because it removes the risk pathway entirely, but it can also have opportunity cost, meaning the organization gives up potential benefits. That is why avoidance should be documented as a deliberate decision tied to appetite, tolerance, and constraints, not as a fear reaction. For beginners, it helps to see avoidance as a controlled choice that is sometimes the most responsible option, especially when risk cannot be reduced to an acceptable level. A defensible avoidance decision should explain what harm was considered unacceptable and why other treatments were insufficient. Reduce is the second treatment, and it is the most common because it allows the organization to pursue value while managing risk through controls. In AI, reduction can mean many things, but the core idea is that you change the system, the process, or the use context so the likelihood or impact of harm decreases. Reduction can include tightening the AI's role so it is advisory rather than determinative, adding human review for high-impact outputs, limiting the scope of automation to low-risk cases, or requiring double checks for certain categories. It can include improving data quality, restricting data inputs, or reducing reliance on sensitive data to lower privacy and fairness risk. It can include improving monitoring to detect drift and harmful patterns early, with clear escalation triggers when thresholds are crossed. It can also include training and policy reinforcement to reduce misuse risk, ensuring employees understand what is allowed and what data cannot be shared. A reduction treatment is only defensible when it is specific about what controls will be implemented and how control effectiveness will be measured. Beginners sometimes confuse reduction with vague promises, like "we will monitor," but reduction requires defined controls, ownership, and evidence. When reduction is done well, it is often the most balanced approach because it supports innovation within safe boundaries. Transfer is the third treatment, and it is often misunderstood because beginners assume it means you can hand the risk to someone else and stop worrying. In reality, transfer means shifting some of the financial or operational burden of risk to another party, but accountability often remains with the organization that uses the AI. Transfer can involve contracts with vendors, insurance arrangements, or third-party services that assume certain responsibilities. In AI, transfer might involve requiring vendors to provide assurances, limitations disclosure, or support for audits, and it might include contractual obligations around data handling, incident notification, and service reliability. Transfer can also involve using third-party review or assurance services to strengthen evidence and reduce uncertainty. However, transfer does not remove the need for internal governance, because the organization still chooses how to use the system and remains responsible for decisions and harms caused to customers or employees. A defensible transfer approach includes clear documentation of responsibilities, clear understanding of what is actually transferred, and controls to verify vendor performance and compliance. If the organization cannot explain what risks were transferred and what risks remain, then transfer becomes an illusion. For beginners, the key is to treat transfer as a way to share burden, not as a way to escape accountability. Accept is the fourth treatment, and it is one of the most important because it forces leadership to make explicit trade-offs. Acceptance means the organization recognizes a risk and chooses to live with it because the benefit outweighs the residual risk and because the risk is within tolerance. Acceptance should not be confused with ignoring risk or failing to implement controls. In many cases, acceptance happens after reduction controls are applied, and the remaining residual risk is accepted through a documented decision. Acceptance can be appropriate for low-impact uses where harm is limited and reversible, or for high-impact uses where controls reduce risk to a level leadership can defend. A strong acceptance decision includes documentation of the risk statement, the evaluation evidence, the controls in place, the monitoring plan, and the rationale for acceptance. It should also include who accepted the risk, because risk acceptance should be made by someone with proper decision rights, often a business owner or executive sponsor. Acceptance should also be time-aware, meaning it may be reviewed periodically because AI risk can change as systems drift and contexts change. For beginners, acceptance is a mature act when done correctly because it acknowledges uncertainty while maintaining accountability and oversight. Retire is the fifth treatment, and it means removing an AI system or AI capability from use, often because it cannot be controlled adequately, no longer provides value, or has become too risky due to changes in context. Retirement is especially relevant in AI because systems can degrade over time and because reliance patterns can shift, making a once acceptable use case become unacceptable. Retire can also apply when a vendor changes a product in ways that undermine transparency or data control, or when new regulatory expectations make the system difficult to defend. Retirement is not a failure. It is a responsible decision when continuing use would create unacceptable exposure. A retirement decision should include a plan for how the system will be turned off, how workflows will adapt, how data will be handled, and how dependencies will be removed. It should also include communication plans for affected stakeholders, especially if customers or employees relied on the system. Retirement should be tracked in the AI inventory and risk register because retired systems can sometimes linger in hidden integrations if not managed carefully. For beginners, retirement is an important concept because it reinforces that risk management is lifecycle management, not only launch management. A program that cannot retire systems becomes trapped by legacy AI risk. Choosing among these treatments requires disciplined reasoning, and one helpful approach is to consider what you are trying to change: likelihood, impact, or exposure. Avoid and retire are often used when the harm potential or obligations make the use case unacceptable regardless of controls, or when controls are not feasible. Reduce is used when controls can meaningfully lower likelihood or impact, especially when you can add oversight, limit scope, and monitor effectively. Transfer is used when risk can be shared through contracts or insurance, but it should still be paired with internal controls because accountability remains. Accept is used when residual risk after controls is within tolerance and the decision is documented and reviewed. Another helpful dimension is controllability, meaning whether the organization can detect issues early and intervene quickly. If controllability is weak, acceptance becomes difficult to defend, especially for high-impact systems. If monitoring and escalation are strong, reduction and acceptance can be more defensible because the organization can respond before harm grows. Beginners should notice that treatment decisions are not simply categories. They are choices tied to control capability and evidence. The most defensible choices are those that match the organization's maturity and that are recorded clearly for accountability. Treatment decisions also need to be consistent across the organization, and this is where the risk register and governance processes matter. If one team accepts a high-impact risk with minimal controls while another team is required to reduce similar risk aggressively, the program becomes inconsistent and leaders lose defensibility. A consistent program uses common criteria to decide when avoidance is required, when reduction controls are mandatory, and when acceptance is allowed. It also uses consistent documentation so the rationale for each decision is visible and reviewable. This is especially important for AI because different departments often face different pressures and may try to justify shortcuts. Governance helps ensure that shortcuts do not become the default and that risk treatments align with enterprise priorities. Treatment decisions should also be linked to key risk indicators, KRIs, because KRI trends can signal when a previously accepted risk is becoming unacceptable and must be retreated. For example, if monitoring shows increasing drift or rising complaints, a risk that was accepted might need to shift toward reduction or even retirement. The living nature of the risk register makes that possible by capturing treatment status and trigger conditions. For beginners, the key idea is that treatment is not a one-time choice. It is a managed posture that can change as conditions change. Let's make these choices more concrete by imagining a high-impact use case like AI influencing which cases receive urgent attention in a support environment. If the organization cannot tolerate missing rare safety-related complaints and cannot reliably monitor classification performance, avoidance might be chosen for automation in those categories, meaning AI is not allowed to route or deprioritize those cases. If the organization wants to use AI for efficiency but can implement controls, reduction might involve requiring that any case with certain characteristics is escalated to human review and that the AI output remains advisory. If the tool is provided by a vendor, transfer might involve contract terms requiring limitations disclosure and prompt incident notification, while internal controls still govern how data is used and how outputs are reviewed. If controls reduce risk to an acceptable level and monitoring is strong, leadership might accept residual risk, documenting the rationale and defining thresholds that trigger reassessment. If later the tool's behavior changes due to vendor updates and risk increases beyond tolerance, retirement might be chosen, removing the feature until a safer alternative exists. This example shows that treatment choices can shift over time as evidence and conditions change. Beginners should see that the program's job is to manage those shifts deliberately, not to pretend that a single approval permanently resolves risk. Another example can clarify transfer and acceptance, because those are often the most misunderstood. Imagine an organization using an external AI tool for drafting internal communications. The inherent risk might be low if no sensitive data is used and outputs are reviewed, so reduction controls might be minimal, and the organization might accept the residual risk. If the organization wants stronger protection, it might transfer some risk by using a vendor contract that limits data retention and provides clear commitments about data handling. However, The organization still must enforce internal rules about what data employees can input and must provide training to prevent misuse. Acceptance here would be a documented decision that the remaining risk is tolerable given controls and the low-impact context, and it should still be subject to periodic review because vendor terms and tool behavior can change. This shows that transfer is not a magical exit and that acceptance is not neglect, but an explicit decision with accountability. For beginners, these nuances matter because exam questions often include tempting answers that imply vendor responsibility eliminates internal obligations. The correct reasoning usually recognizes shared responsibility and the need for internal controls even when transfer is used. To close, choosing risk treatments wisely is about making deliberate, defensible decisions that align with risk appetite, tolerance, and operational capability. Avoidance is a boundary choice where the organization refuses a use case or a use pattern because harm is unacceptable or constraints cannot be met. Reduction is the most common approach, using controls like human oversight, scope limits, data restrictions, monitoring, and training to lower likelihood and impact. Transfer shares burden through contracts or insurance, but does not remove the organization's accountability for outcomes and must be paired with internal governance. Acceptance is an explicit decision that residual risk is within tolerance, supported by evidence, controls, monitoring, and proper decision rights, and it should be revisited as conditions change. Retirement removes a system from use when it no longer provides value, cannot be controlled, or becomes indefensible due to drift, vendor changes, or new obligations, and it must be managed carefully to remove dependencies. When you understand these treatments as living choices tied to evidence and monitoring, you gain a powerful way to manage AI risk without either freezing innovation or inviting preventable harm. This treatment discipline sets up the next episode, where we focus on managing exceptions safely, because exceptions are where treatment choices are often tested under real-world pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.